The story of the Titanic is often taught as a tragedy of hubris and a giant iceberg, but the official narrative rarely explores the convergence of political power and financial timing that occurred in its wake. For over a century, the sinking has been framed as a freak accident, yet when the maritime records are placed alongside the legislative records of 1913, a pattern emerges that suggests the disaster may have been the catalyst for a silent revolution in global finance. This was the birth of the Federal Reserve, a system that would come to dominate the world, and it was established only after the most powerful voices against it were silenced by the North Atlantic. In the early 1900s, a fierce battle was being waged over the future of the American economy. On one side were the titans of banking, led by figures like J.P. Morgan, who envisioned a central bank capable of controlling the nation's money supply. On the other side were some of the wealthiest and most influential men in the world, Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim. These men were more than just millionaires, they were formidable roadblocks. Astor, worth the equivalent of nearly $3 billion today, had spoken publicly against the concentration of monetary control. Straus, a former congressman and co-owner of Macy's, used his political connections to oppose the legal frameworks that would allow a private central bank to operate under a federal charter. These men possessed the wealth, the status, and the independence to block the banking interests centered on Morgan-affiliated institutions. J.P. Morgan, who owned the White Star Line through his International Mercantile Marine Company, had originally booked a suite on the Titanic's maiden voyage. However, in a move that has fueled speculation for over 100 years, he canceled his trip at the last minute, citing ill health. Curiously, he was photographed just 5 days after the sinking at a resort in France, appearing to be in excellent health. While Morgan stayed behind, his three primary rivals, Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim, all boarded the ship. When the Titanic slipped beneath the waves on April 15, 1912, the resistance to the central banking movement was effectively decapitated. The fortunes of these men entered prolonged probate, their political influence vanished, and the movement they led went quiet. The timeline that followed the sinking is perhaps the most compelling piece of the puzzle. Within just 20 months of the disaster, 3 fundamental shifts in American governance, each of which had been resisted for decades, were successfully implemented. On February 3, 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified, authorizing a federal income tax after a similar attempt had failed years prior. On April 8, 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified, transferring the election of senators from state legislatures to a popular vote, removing a critical structural check on federal power. Finally, on December 23, 1913, while 27 senators were absent for the Christmas holiday, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. The banking coup was complete. The sequence of events suggests that the sinking provided the ultimate clean slate for the architects of the new financial order. Beyond the political implications are the technical anomalies of the voyage itself. Captain Edward J. Smith, a veteran with decades of service, was on his retirement voyage. Despite receiving at least 6 iceberg warnings on April 14th, documented in the ship's wireless logs, the route was not altered and the speed was not reduced. While official inquiries focused on equipment failures and lifeboats, they never fully addressed why the seasoned captain ignored persistent warnings from other vessels. Some researchers point to a private communication Smith received that day, the contents of which were never recorded. The lack of response to known hazards remains one of the glaring inconsistencies in the official record. The shift in the world following 1912 wasn't just financial, it was cultural and structural. Before the sinking, the era was defined by Beaux-Arts architecture and craftsmanship, grand structures like the Library of Congress and the original Pennsylvania Station, which required decades of specialized training in stone and ironwork. The Titanic was a floating expression of this civilization. However, after 1915, this style of construction virtually vanished. Historical interviews with craftsmen from that era revealed that the work didn't stop because the skills were lost, but because the contracts stopped coming. The economy moved toward faster construction, simplified styles, and centralized control. The era of the independent craftsman and the independent financier was replaced by a more rigid, standardized system. The archival evidence for these events is not hidden, it is simply fragmented across different repositories. The passenger manifest is in London, the wireless logs are in Maritime records, and the legislative votes are in the Congressional Record. No single official history has examined these records as a single connected sequence. We are told that Titanic was a tragedy of ice and arrogance, while the Federal Reserve was a necessary modernization of a chaotic system. Both explanations are plausible in isolation, but they remain silent on the proximity of the dates. If the sinking of the Titanic was indeed orchestrated, it represents one of the most ruthless and successful power grabs in human history. By framing the event as a natural disaster, the world's attention was diverted towards safety regulations rather than the sudden disappearance of the banking reform's most powerful enemies. The silence that followed the deaths of Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim lasted exactly long enough for the new financial system to take root. Today, the Titanic rests 2.5 miles down in the North Atlantic, its grand staircase and oak carvings consumed by time. Yet the financial structures that rose in the months following its disappearance continue to govern our lives, a legacy of a 20-month window where history was rewritten and the opposition was erased. We remember the tragedy of the lives lost, but we must also look at the world that was built on top of the wreckage. The archive is still there, and the sequence remains for those willing to read it.